The crystal lights above fell like silent drops of lightning, and in that instant, a voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as a blade. "Clean the floor, that's your job." The sound didn't just slice through the room, it sliced through a man's dignity. The entire ballroom of the Astoria Grand, the most luxurious hotel in Midtown Manhattan, froze for a few seconds before breaking into crisp laughter. It wasn't laughter born of humor, but applause in a play of power where people laughed to remind one another that they were on top. Jordan Ellis, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, stood in the spotlight. He didn't speak, didn't bend, didn't react. His deep brown eyes narrowed slightly, as if recording every breath in the room. What those around him didn't know was that his silence wasn't submission. It was control. From the VIP table at the center, William Harrington, the third 39-years-old heir to Harrington, Industries, smirked with the kind of arrogance that made him look like he owned the very air around him. Beside him, his fiancée, the golden-haired Brooke Whitman, raised her champagne glass and pointed toward a wine stain on the marble floor. "It's dripping near your shoes," she said sweetly, her voice half sugar, half venom. "Be useful, will you?" Laughter broke out again. The tuxedoed guests, their Swiss watches glinting under the chandeliers, smiled with that knowing smirk. In their world, smiles were weapons, and another person's silence was a trophy. Jordan stood tall, straight, and still. His face betrayed no tremor, but inside, his heart beat one slow, deep pulse. He had heard words like these before from different mouths in different rooms, back when he was the son of a hotel janitor. And right here at this same Astoria Grand, 30 years ago, he had once sat outside the kitchen door, waiting for his father to finish his shift. Now he had returned not with a mop, but with power. Will Harrington chuckled loud enough for everyone to hear. "You know, these events really need better staff screening." Jordan's shoulders tensed for just a moment. Then he turned his tone calm. "You might want to lower your voice." Will tilted his head, his smirk widening. "Why are you the floor manager?" A second of silence. Then Jordan replied softly, each word landing like steel. "No, I'm the reason this ballroom still exists." No one understood what he meant. No one dared to ask. Brooke laughed, the hollow laugh of someone unfamiliar with truth. "That's cute," she sneered. "Maybe take your attitude back to the service corridor." Jordan looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, then pulled out his phone. With one tap, his voice dropped low. "Proceed with the update. Log everything that happens in this room." The music still played violins, soaring elegantly, but beneath it, the rhythm of power had changed direction. At the corner of the room, Sofia Alvarez, a 22-year-old Latina waitress, held her tray of glasses, trembling. She had seen it all. When Jordan's eyes found hers, he gave a small nod. A subtle gesture, but it said enough: keep recording. Every truth needs a witness. Her throat tightened as she lifted her phone, hands shaking, but the frame stayed clear. The laughter at the Harrington table began to falter. No one knew why, but a strange unease crept into the air as if the joke had lost its target. Jordan turned toward the massive gold-framed mirror behind the bar. In its reflection, he saw the image of a man who once bent down to scrub these same floors, his father, Thomas Ellis. A man with calloused hands who used to say, "Son, the tone of someone's voice will tell you what they think you are, and also show you what they really are." Jordan drew a slow breath. Those words still lived within him, and tonight, he knew he would need them. From the center table, Will's voice rang out again. See the helps getting bold these days. Scattered laughter followed, but this time Jordan didn't stay still. He took one measured step forward, just enough for the chandelier light to catch his face. His voice was quiet, deliberate. Stage 2 confirmed. On the other end of the call, a woman's voice came through clearly. Yes, sir. Protocol 7. Active. 50 billion merger on hold, pending your word. No one caught the full sentence, only fragments beneath the music. But Jordan's expression, as he lowered his phone, made Sophia's pulse race. It wasn't the look of a man humiliated. It was the look of a man holding judgment. He turned, set his glass on the table with precise alignment among the others. A small gesture, yet deliberate, disciplined. Clean floors, he repeated softly, almost a whisper. Maybe. But tonight I'm cleaning house. The words were too quiet to grasp, but every eye turned toward him. The chandelier lights flickered, the violins slipped off key, and somewhere within that gilded room, an invisible line was crossed. Sophia glanced down at her phone, her heart pounding. She didn't know if she was recording the beginning of a $50 billion reckoning or a lesson in human dignity. Jordan knew. He felt the chill rising from the marble floor, but his heart burned hot. In the silence, he was rewriting the definition of one simple word: respect. And tonight, in this room where people confused privilege with class, he would remind them of what they had forgotten. Not everyone in a tuxedo is a gentleman, and not everyone who stays silent is weak. The night had only begun, and somewhere in the blinding light of the Astoria, Grand Justice had just opened its eyes. The air inside the grand hall of the Astoria Grand began to distort, as if someone had just clenched the heart of the room with an invisible hand. The laughter that once filled the space now sounded hollow and misplaced. People still tried to laugh, but the sound came out dry, artificial, like the clinking of glasses with no one left to toast. Jordan Ellis remained where he was, unmoving, silent, slowly turning the cuff of his sleeve as if holding his breath steady in the middle of a storm. Across the room, William Harrington leaned forward, his tone sweet as sugar, but his gaze sharp as a blade. You know, for someone who wasn't invited, you seem awfully comfortable here. Jordan looked up, not angry, just slightly tilting his head, observing him the way one studies a rare creature behind glass. His reply came slow, deliberate. Funny I could say the same about entitlement. Brooke Will's fiancée let out a light giggle, her voice delicate but laced with poison. Sweetheart, he's trying to sound smart. How cute. She turned to her friends, her pitch rising just enough for nearby tables to hear. He probably delivers wine when he's not pretending to belong here. A few older men laughed in agreement while the younger ones looked away. Some eyes wavered, but no one spoke up. In this world, silence was currency, and here everyone feared losing value. Jordan said nothing. He simply glanced up at the crystal clock on the wall, its metallic glow casting soft light across his face, deepening the darkness in his eyes. 9:47 in the evening. He knew that at this very moment, Jenna Park, his assistant at the New York headquarters, was monitoring the entire gala through a hidden camera inside the lapel pin on his jacket. Every smile, every insult, it was all being recorded. He remembered what his father used to say, after long days mopping hotel floors. You don't need to shout to prove your worth. Just let people expose themselves. And tonight, he was letting them do exactly that. A waiter passed by and whispered quietly, "Sir, they think you're staff." Jordan nodded lightly, his eyes softening, though a cold curve appeared at the corner of his lips. "Good," he said calmly. "Let them show me who they are when no one's watching." At the main table, Will continued performing for his audience. He lifted his glass, scanning the room like a king surveying his kingdom. "The help's getting bold these days," he declared, his crooked grin brimming with arrogance. Laughter followed again, weak-forced, but enough for him to believe he was still in control. Brooke leaned toward him, speaking just loud enough for Jordan to hear. Maybe he sneaked in to see how rich people eat. At that moment, Jordan brushed his fingers over the phone in his pocket. A message flashed across the screen from Jenna Protocol 7, confirmed. "Board on standby. Proceed when ready." He inhaled deeply, not out of anger, but out of awareness, knowing this moment would be etched into history. A second later, he set his glass down carefully, aligning it perfectly with the others, the same way he always did when centering himself. A young waitress passed by, Sofia Alvarez, the same girl who had been quietly recording everything. Her eyes were wide with concern, her hands trembling slightly. Jordan met her gaze and gave a single nod, the kind that said, "Justice often begins with one person, brave enough not to turn off the camera." She nodded back, her eyes glistening but steady. The violin solo began, but the music now sounded fractured. Even the musician could feel the tension in the air, his bow trembling across the strings. Jordan stood tall, the reflection of the crystal glass casting silver light across his face. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. Stage 2 confirmed. No one around him heard, but on the other end of the line, Jenna had just activated the internal systems of Ellis Capital Group. Every transaction related to the $50 billion merger with Harrington Industries was now suspended indefinitely. Yet here inside this gilded ballroom, no one realized that each mocking word they had just spoken was shaking the foundation of an empire. A middle-aged guest with silver hair turned to the man beside him. "Who is he?" The other shrugged. "Probably one of the event staff." Jordan heard them. He smiled faintly, a thin smile masking the sting beneath. He was used to being measured by the tie he wore, not the mind he carried. And then, amid the noise, his gaze caught the massive mirror at the far end of the room. In it, he saw not just his reflection, but the shadow of his father. The man he once watched on his knees, scrubbing floors, lowering his head to avoid the sting of contempt. It was a memory Jordan once wished to forget, but tonight it had become his strength. He murmured under his breath, "Maybe I am my father's son, but I'm also the man who bought the floor he used to clean." At the main table, Will was still laughing, his voice loud and smug. "You know what's funny? People like him always think they belong where they don't." Jordan turned toward him, his eyes calm still as a lake before a storm. He lifted his phone and pressed a single key. "Confirm live logging." A faint click echoed. The entire room seemed to drop in the temperature. A silence so dense filled the air that one could hear the faint fizz of champagne bubbles bursting in their glasses. Then Jordan spoke, his voice low, but cutting through the stillness. "You wanted better staff screening, Mr. Harrington." A pause, then his cold smile appeared. "Well, tonight consider it done." No one understood. No one reacted. But 60 floors above, inside Ellis Capital headquarters, Jenna pressed the final key, Protocol 7 active. At that exact moment, the trade servers executed a full suspension of the merger agreement. A single line of data appeared on the screen. Transaction, $50 billion. Status on hold. Back in the ballroom, Jordan placed his phone on the table, calm and unhurried. Sophia glanced around, feeling as though a thin current of electricity was moving through the air, silent but alive. Will and Brooke still hadn't realized what had happened. They kept chatting and laughing, but a few guests had begun to sense something. There was a shift in the atmosphere, a quiet authority in Jordan's eyes that made them fall silent, one by one. He looked around the room, his gaze cutting through every face that tried to appear composed. Let them laugh, he thought. They're writing their own testimony. And in the corner of the room, the crystal lights still glimmered, but this time they didn't just illuminate gold and silver. They exposed the shadows of those burying themselves in arrogance. As the music came to an end, Will turned still, wearing that half-smile. "Why so serious, my friend? You'll ruin the mood." Jordan's reply was quiet, his voice ringing like steel striking glass. "Oh, I'm not ruining it. I'm just recording it." In that instant, everything stopped. The music died, the laughter dissolved, and all that remained was breath cold heavy and laced with the metallic scent of truth about to be revealed. Tonight, under the crystal lights of the Astoria Grand, the balance of power had shifted hands. And they didn't know it yet, but the man they had just mocked was the very one who could erase the name Harrington from Wall Street with a single command. The music inside the Astoria Grand Ballroom shifted no longer the soft flow of jazz, but something heavier, a rhythm like the breath of a storm before it breaks. Jordan Ellis stood motionless, surrounded by a sea of tuxedos and glittering gowns among the clinking of crystal glasses and the shimmer of gold light. But now every gaze was starting to turn toward him, not in admiration, but in confusion. He didn't need them to understand. He only needed them to see. At the central table, William Harrington continued his performance, his voice growing louder, as if volume alone could rebuild his confidence. "This is a private event, you know," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug curl of his lips. "Security should really check the guest list better next time." Brooke, his fiancée, laughed softly, her fingers circling the rim of her glass as she cast Jordan a look of mock pity. "Maybe he wandered in from the service corridor," she said, with a sweet, cutting tone. Poor thing. A few others joined in with half-hearted laughter, but even in their chuckles, something felt strained. Jordan still said nothing. He only glanced toward Sophia, the young waitress standing near the buffet. Her hand tightened around her phone, her eyes blinking fast. He gave a small nod, a simple signal that spoke louder than words. She swallowed hard, then slowly lifted her phone again. Every second that passed, the frame on that little screen was turning into living evidence. Jordan slipped a hand into his pocket, his thumb brushing against his own phone. He turned on the front camera, seeing his reflection on the screen, the still face of a man long accustomed to being misunderstood. He remembered his father, Thomas Ellis, smiling through humiliation, obeying orders just to preserve enough dignity to survive the day. That night, Jordan had made himself a promise. If he ever stood in the same kind of room, no one else would ever have to bow again. And tonight, he was keeping that promise. Will's voice cut through the air again, louder now. "Tell me, my friend, what exactly do you do here? Shine the silverware? Or sweep the floor?" Laughter burst like toxic fireworks. Jordan didn't blink. He simply lifted his glass, took a small sip and set it down in precise alignment with the others, as if he were restoring balance to the entire room. "I build things," he said, his voice low and steady. A pause followed. "Mostly companies. Sometimes people." Brooke laughed sharply, her tone shrill like shattering glass. "Oh, a motivational speaker. How adorable." A few guests laughed awkwardly, others looked away. Deep down, a strange awareness was dawning, the unsettling realization that they might have just mocked the wrong man. Will propped his elbow on the table, leaning forward, his voice lowering to a sneer. "Listen, I don't know how you got in here, but this event's exclusive. Security must have missed you." He gestured toward 2 guards at the back of the hall. "We'll fix that." The 2 tall men in black suits exchanged glances, and one began to move forward. The music continued, but the trembling violin notes betrayed the tension that now gripped the air. Before the guards could reach him, a nervous voice broke through the room. "Excuse me," everyone turned. It was Sophia. She stood there holding an empty tray, her eyes fixed on Will. Her voice trembled, but it carried clearly. He's not staff. I saw his name on the guest list." The room fell silent. Will turned his head, his gaze cold and sharp. "What did you just say?" Sophia swallowed hard, her hands shaken, but she spoke again. "His name. Jordan Ellis, near the top." A murmur spread through the crowd. People craned their necks. Brooke frowned, lowering her voice to Will. Probably a typo. Will gave a short, mocking laugh. "Honey, I own the list." Jordan looked up, his eyes calm and cold, gleaming like steel. "Then you already know how much it's about to cost you." The air cracked with silence. Will raised an eyebrow, forcing a laugh. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jordan didn't answer. He turned to Sophia, his voice softening. "Thank you. You've done your part." The guards hesitated, unsure of their next move. Jordan reached into his jacket and pulled out a black card, placing it on the table. Silver letters gleamed under the chandelier Ellis Capital Group. The reflection off the metal surface made the logo appear to glow. Jordan spoke quietly, but his words carried across the room. "Ever heard of it?" Will blinked his confusion, growing. "Of course. They're an acquisition target," Jordan cut him off. "Were." Past tense. The word were dropped like a hammer. Whispers rippled through the room. Brooke's face drained of color, her hand clutching her glass until her knuckles turned white. People were beginning to understand. Jordan turned to the guards, still standing nearby. "You can stay. You're not the problem tonight." One of them nodded, slowly, stepping back. His eyes now filled with a respect Jordan had never asked for. Will gave a strained, nervous laugh. "Cute trick." "You really think anyone believes you own that company?" Jordan raised his head, his tone calm as still water after a storm. "I don't think he said evenly." "I know." The moment he finished, 2 figures appeared at the entrance, Daniel Cho and Priya Patel, both senior executives of Ellis Capital Group. The room fell into a collective hush. Those who had laughed now froze. They recognized the faces from the Forbes cover just weeks ago. Brooke lowered her glass, her voice barely a whisper. "Wait, Jordan Ellis." As in the Ellis Capital. Will turned to her, his voice hoarse. "That's impossible." Jordan turned slowly to face him again. "Tell me, Will," he said, his tone light, but every word razor sharp. "What does it feel like to mistake ownership for service?" No one laughed. No one dared breathe. Only the violin remained trembling through the silence. The question required no answer. It was a verdict delivered in a calm voice. Will sat frozen, his smile suspended mid-expression, the chandelier light making him look like a porcelain statue about to crack. Jordan said nothing more. He simply turned his glass, his gaze sweeping over the room, over every illusion of power now beginning to fracture. And in that moment, Sophia understood. True strength doesn't come from shouting. It comes from knowing the exact moment when silence should speak. And tonight, that silence had just found its voice. The ballroom fell silent, a heavy silence so dense that even the sound of breathing felt like a confession. The crystal lights still sparkled overhead, but now their glow was no longer the warm luxury of power. It was the cold light of judgment. Jordan Ellis said nothing. He simply placed his glass back down, precisely in its original position, neat and perfect, just like the man himself. Somehow that small gesture made the entire room tremble. William Harrington slumped in his chair, his eyes blinking rapidly as his mind struggled to grasp what was happening. Brooke, his fiancée, looked down, her hands trembling. She had always seen Will as the strongest man in the room, but now she wasn't sure how much longer he could hold that title. A middle-aged guest nearby leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Wait, if he's the Jordan Ellis, doesn't that mean?" The other nodded slowly, eyes wide in disbelief, that the merger's already his. From the doorway, Daniel Cho and Priya Patel, the two executive directors of Ellis Capital Group, stepped forward. Light glinted across the silver badges pinned to their lapels. No introductions were needed, no explanations required. Their presence alone was enough for anyone in the financial world to realize the game was over. Will jumped to his feet, forcing a laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're bluffing." Jordan met his eyes calm but cold. "Try me." Brooke grabbed Will's arm, her voice shaking with fear. "Will, stop. I've seen his face before. Forbes, the Wall Street Journal." Will yanked his arm away and snapped, "Don't embarrass me." Jordan slowly took a step back, as if clearing space for the collapse that was about to happen. He pulled out his phone and pressed a single button. The voice of his assistant, Jenna Park, came through the speaker, crisp and cutting like a blade through silk. Board approval confirmed. Merger officially suspended. The words hit the room like a stone dropped into still water. Heads lifted, others turned, whispers began to spread like ripples. Brooke went pale. Will let out a sharp, broken laugh. "Suspended. You think you can just..." Jordan cut him off, his voice, quiet but firm. "I don't think Will. I act." At the back of the room, Sofia Alvarez still held her phone, recording everything. Her hands no longer trembled. People around her began to step aside, leaving a clear space in the center of the ballroom, as if they were seated in a courtroom waiting for a verdict. Jordan took a step forward and spoke slowly. "When I said I build things, I meant it. I built Ellis Capital from nothing. And now I'm dismantling the arrogance that thought it could buy respect." He paused, his eyes flicking toward Will, the man once accustomed to applause, now wrestling with the most primal fear of all, the fear of losing control. In the back, Lauren Kim, a reporter from Forbes Live, lowered her camera and whispered to her cameraman, "Are you getting this?" He nodded silently. Lauren murmured, "This isn't just a story. It's history." Will's voice broke into a shout, his arrogance unraveling into panic. "You can't do this. This is a private event." Jordan didn't turn around. He just spoke softly, his tone slicing through the air. So was the merger. Until 5 minutes ago. A low wave of murmurs spread and swelled. For the first time that night, no one was laughing at Will's words. Those who had been his allies were now silent, their eyes glued to the floor. The silence he once believed to be a symbol of authority had turned against him. Sophia stepped forward half a pace, her voice gentle but clear. "You shouldn't talk to him like that." Every head turned toward her. Will glared, his voice sharp. "Watch your tone." Jordan lifted a hand, stopping him with a single word. "Don't." That one word locked the air in place. He looked directly at Will. "You've already revealed who you are. She just reminded us who we should be." Lauren Kim, still holding her camera, spoke softly. "Mr. Ellis, may I quote that?" Jordan gave a small nod. "Quote it. Print it. Broadcast it. Maybe someone will learn before they hire the next Harrington." A few soft laughs broke the tension, not mocking laughter, but the kind that comes when the truth finally breathes. The younger guests exchanged glances, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and shame. Jordan didn't look at them. His gaze was fixed on Will, and in Will's eyes he saw it the collapse of an empire. Then a phone rang. All eyes turned. It was Will's phone, the screen glowing with the words, "Harrington Board Urgent." He hesitated. The room held its breath. Then he answered and put it on speaker. A man's furious voice exploded through the silence. "What the hell happened? The deal's gone! Markets are reacting already!" Gasps spread across the room. Some guests pulled out their phones to check the news. One whispered, "It's real. The deal's really off." Jordan didn't smile. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, his voice calm and even like reading a verdict aloud. Some lessons don't need shouting. Just consequences. Will dropped the phone, his face drained of color sweat glistening on his forehead. Brooke pulled her hand away and stepped back. A small space opened between them, the space where loss begins. Jordan turned to Sophia, his voice softening. "Keep recording. Truth deserves witnesses." She nodded, lips pressed, tight eyes, glimmering with tears. For the first time that night, her gaze held no fear, only faith. Lauren Kim turned to her team and whispered, "He's rewriting corporate ethics in real time." Jordan began to walk toward the exit, the click of his shoes echoing sharply against the marble floor. Each step was a countdown to the fall of the Harrington Empire. And when he reached the doors, he spoke without turning back. "You called security on me in my own deal. Now you'll learn what real security looks like." The words fell heavy like prophecy. That night, under the crystal lights of the Astoria Grand Power, changed hands, quietly, lawfully, without a gun, without a shout. All it took was one man silent enough to make the world listen. No one spoke for more than 10 seconds. A silence hung so heavy, it felt like a stone pressing on every chest in that gilded room. Somewhere in the distance, the music had stopped leaving, only the faint, nervous clinking of glasses, small, brittle sounds, afraid of their own echo. Jordan Ellis stood in the center of the Astoria Grand Ballroom, his face reflecting the light of 1,000 crystals. It was not the glow of triumph, but the cold illumination of justice. Justice doesn't need to shout it, only needs witnesses. Across from him, William Harrington III struggled to find his voice, his throat dry as if filled with metal shavings. You think you can embarrass me?" In front of my investors, Jordan lifted his gaze, his calmness sharp enough to wound. "Embarrassment requires reputation, Will. You sold yours the moment you opened your mouth." The words landed like a punch without sound. Brooke, his fiancée, gasped softly, her hand over her lips, and several guests nearby gave slight nods, not out of admiration, but acknowledgement. Jordan turned toward the orchestra, his voice light but clear. "Play something soft. This deal's over." The conductor hesitated for a heartbeat, then lifted his baton. A slow, mournful jazz melody began to play heavy with the weight of the room. Jordan turned and began to walk away. Each step was deliberate, powerful. The click of his black leather shoes on marble echoed through the hall, a steady rhythm of real authority, the kind that doesn't demand obedience, but commands it by presence alone. Behind him, Sophia Alvarez, the young waitress, still held her phone. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but this time there was no fear. "I got it all. Every second." No one answered, but dozens of eyes turned toward her. She stood taller now, no longer hiding her phone. Brooke snapped, her voice shrill. "You can't film us. That's illegal." Sophia lifted her chin, her eyes wet but unwavering. "So is humiliation." Her words spread softly like breath, but they struck deep into the heart of the room. A man's voice rose from the corner, Marcus Bennett, a black staff member who had stood silent the entire evening. "She's right," he said. "I saw everything too." That sound flung open a door everyone had tried to keep shut. A few guests who had laughed earlier now turned away, faces flushed with shame. A middle-aged woman set her glass down and whispered to her friend. "He warned them. Twice." Jordan stopped and turned back, his gaze sweeping across the room like a cold wind. "You don't need to argue," he said softly, his voice so gentle it stole the air from everyone's lungs. "You already did enough by standing still." A single high violin note pierced the air, then vanished like a period closing the chapter of the night. Lauren Kim, the Forbes Live reporter, stepped forward. The microphone in her trembling hand betrayed her racing pulse. "Mr. Ellis," she asked, "is this your official statement regarding the Harrington deal?" Jordan looked at her, his eyes deep and sharp as glass. "Not yet," he said, "but it will be." The answer hit like a spark. Guests pulled out their phones. Some began recording, others sent frantic messages, fingers shaking. Will sat motionless, his expression vacant, like a man waking from a dream of power. Lauren lowered her camera, her voice now a whisper, almost a confession. "He's turning humiliation into history." Jordan looked back at Will. "You called me staff," he said evenly, his tone cold. "That's fine. I've cleaned worse messes than this deal." Brooke inhaled sharply, trying to defend herself. "You're exaggerating. We were just joking. You people are so sensitive these days." Jordan met her eyes without blinking. "No," he replied. "I'm just attentive." He pulled out his phone and spoke clearly, his voice cutting through the air like steel. "Jenna, confirm Phase 2. The voice of his secretary came through the speaker, crisp and final like a verdict. "Confirmed, sir." "Board approval received. Merger officially terminated." The room erupted in frantic whispers. Did she just say, "Terminated 50 billion gone"? "Oh my God," Will jumped up his face. Read his voice cracking. "You can't do that. That's not how business works." Jordan turned to him, his gaze solid as granite. "Business works, however, I decide when you're on my payroll." Another wave of murmurs swept across the hall. Lauren glanced quickly at her cameraman and whispered, "That line's going viral tonight." Will stumbled, gripping the edge of the table, as if trying to hold on to the last fragments of his power. "You think you can humiliate me?" he shouted. "You think money makes you better than me?" Jordan's answer came slow, every word heavy as a hammer. "I don't have money, Will. I have ownership. There's a difference." The room went still. No one dared move. Some guests exchanged glances, then nodded quietly. They understood. They had just witnessed the moment power was redefined. Sophia swallowed hard, whispering to herself, "That's how justice sounds." Jordan stepped closer to Will. His eyes were no longer cold. They were calm, almost pitying, as if looking at a child who had broken something without understanding its worth. "You called me out of place," he said. "But the only thing out of place here is your decency." Will's hand trembled, the wine in his glass rippling. He tried to speak, but no sound came out. Jordan bowed his head slightly, not in respect, but in closure. He spoke softly, just loud enough for the cameras to catch it. You don't shout to prove who you are. You just stay long enough for the truth to echo. And in that moment, inside the grand hall, filled with people who once mocked him, silence rang louder than laughter ever could. Not everyone would understand it right away, but years later, when people spoke of that night at the Astoria Grand, they would give it a name. The night dignity spoke. The night when arrogance became evidence, and one silent man brought down an empire with just 3 words. Protocol 7 active. The music stopped completely. The vast ballroom of the Astoria Grand was now filled only with the sound of quick, uneven breaths from people who had once believed themselves untouchable. The glittering chandeliers no longer glowed with the warmth of luxury. Their light had turned harsh, exposing every crack in the illusion of grandeur. William Harrington stood frozen amid the invisible ruins of his own empire. His face, red with fury just moments ago, was now pale as wax. His eyes darted around, searching for an ally, but all he found were bowed heads. The same people who once flattered him now avoided his gaze, as if his downfall were contagious. Jordan Ellis walked toward him slowly, his voice no longer cold, but calm in a way that was far more frightening. You can't lose what you never owned, Will. You only borrowed it. Will's hands trembled as he forced a crooked smile. You think you can walk into my event and destroy me? Jordan stopped his gaze, steady his tone low and deep, like thunder beneath the ground. No. You destroyed yourself the moment you confused arrogance for worth. The words froze the room. An older woman at a nearby table whispered. He warned him twice. He didn't listen. Then, cutting through the heavy air, Lauren Kim, the Forbes Live reporter, lowered her camera and asked Mr. Ellis, "Are you officially ending the Harrington partnership?" Jordan turned toward her, his voice clear and steady as he looked straight into the lens. As of this moment, all Harrington assets are frozen pending review. Their partnership with Ellis Capital no longer exists. The sound of people gasping rippled through the crowd. A few guests immediately pulled out their phones to check the market. Screens lit up across the room. Langford Industries stock down 16% in 3 minutes. Will looked around, desperate. You can't just do that," he shouted. Jordan replied, his tone unchanged. "I already did." Brooke turned toward him, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Will, stop, please. It's over." But he didn't hear her. All that remained in him was anger, the final instinct of someone who had lived too long at the top denial. "You think this makes you powerful? You think this makes you better than me?" Jordan looked at him for a long moment, then spoke softly. "Power isn't about being better, Will. It's about knowing when to stop." The sentence fell into every mind like a bell tolling in the night. In the corner, Sofia Alvarez gripped her phone tighter, her small hand trembling not from fear, but from emotion. She was witnessing something she had never believed possible. A black man once called the janitor's son, standing tall as an empire, bowed before him, not through rage or shouting, but through calm. Then another sound sliced through the silence, sharp and violent. Will slammed his glass onto the table. It shattered red wine, spreading like blood across the white marble floor. He stormed toward Jordan, his face contorted with fury. "You don't belong here," he screamed. "This is our world, not yours." Jordan didn't move. His eyes darkened, not from fear, but from recognition of the truth his father had once spoken. Sometimes people aren't afraid of losing money. They're afraid of losing the illusion that they're above others. Jordan's reply came low and even every word cutting like a blade through glass. Then you should have built it yourself. A deep note seemed to echo inside every mind, the closing sound of a chapter in history. Will gripped another glass and in blind rage hurled it at Jordan. The crystal shattered, splashing red wine across his black suit like a wound. Glass fragments scattered on the floor, glittering under the light. "Oh my God," someone shouted. Another voice followed. "He just threw that at him?" Sophia kept recording her hands, shaking uncontrollably. Jordan looked down at his stained suit, then up again, his eyes glowing with something fierce, yet composed. He pulled out a handkerchief, slowly wiped the wine away, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table before Will. "You just made this official," he said quietly. Will roared. "What are you gonna do?" "Call your lawyers." Jordan's voice was calm now, almost detached. "No, I call my standards." He pulled out his phone and pressed a button. "Jenna, initiate legal containment. Record begins now." Instantly, the ceiling speakers of the hotel came alive with the crisp, professional voice of Jenna Park. "Confirmed, sir. Recording live." Incident logged under contract breach protocol. A few guests flinched. A young man leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Oh my God. He's recording everything. It's legal now." Will's face went pale, his lips trembling. "You wouldn't dare." Jordan looked up, his expression carrying a chill for the first time that night. "I already did." Behind him, Daniel and Priya stepped forward, each holding a small device. Daniel raised his phone and announced for all to hear, security footage. Synced. Legal timestamp verified. Witnesses documented. There was no music, no chatter, only the cold hum of data being transmitted, like metal scraping against stone. Will stumbled back. Brooke covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes, as she whispered, "He warned you, Will. He warned you so many times." Jordan took a single step forward, not fast, not aggressive, just enough to make the man before him retreat. "Congratulations, Will," he said, his voice even detached, almost sympathetic. "You didn't just lose a deal. You built my case." A few guests murmured under their breath, "Oh my God." The chandeliers reflected against the wine-stained marble streaks of red, shimmering like the melting crown of a fallen king. Jordan pulled another card from his pocket and dropped it into the puddle of wine, letting the silver lettering gleam under the light. Ellis Capital Group founder and CEO Jordan Ellis. He spoke slowly, each word, like the final strike of a gavel. "You mistook silence for submission. That was your last mistake." The room erupted in hushed chaos, filled with whispers of awe and fear. Lauren Kim lifted her camera again, her voice barely above a breath. "History is happening right here." Jordan turned away, leaving behind a room full of shattered glass and a man stripped of everything, his money, his name, and his dignity. As he stepped through the doorway, the hallway light washed over him, casting a faint halo around his back. No one dared stop him. No one dared speak, because tonight in the heart of New York City, an empire had fallen not by force, not by scandal, but by the silence of a man who knew exactly who he was. No one inside the Astoria Grand would ever forget that moment, the moment the glass shattered and red wine spilled across the front of Jordan Ellis's suit. It wasn't just a burst of anger. It was the mark of collapse, the instant an empire signed its own death warrant with its own hand. Jordan didn't look at the stain. He looked straight at Will Harrington, the man who had just thrown away everything he believed was power. Jordan's gaze was calm, not a trace of fury, only one thing remained in his eyes. Confirmation. His voice was low and steady, every word clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. You just turned humiliation into evidence. A shiver passed through the crowd. No one dared breathe, no one dared move. Those who had laughed at Jordan earlier now could only stare down at the floor, where the chandelier's light reflected off the pool of red wine, like the blood of a fallen king. From behind him, Daniel Cho stepped forward, his tone professional and cold. Security footage confirmed, timestamp verified, legal containment active. Those words, when spoken, sounded like the click of handcuffs closing. William Harrington, a man who once wore wealth and power like armor, now stood exposed in the light surrounded by evidence and witnesses. Lauren Kim, the reporter from Forbes Live, lifted her camera, her voice trembling. This is being broadcasted right now. Live. The entire room looked up. Some stepped back in shock. Will spun around, eyes wild. "Turn that off, do you hear me? Turn that off." But no one moved, not a single person. Those who had once followed his every order now understood the power in this room no longer belonged to him. Jordan looked around, then slowly bent down and picked up a shard of broken crystal from the shattered glass. He turned it in his fingers, letting it catch the light, and spoke quietly, almost to himself. Fragile things break when they forget what they're made of. One sentence, but it froze the air solid. Brooke covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Will, her voice breaking. "He warned you. Everyone heard it." "He warned you twice." Will didn't respond. His eyes stayed fixed on Jordan, filled with horror and hatred, the look of a man watching himself being stripped bare. Jordan dropped the crystal shard onto the table, then reached into his jacket and pulled out another business card, placing it in front of Will. The card was soaked in wine, but the silver letters still gleamed under the light. Ellis Capital Group founder and CEO Jordan Ellis. "You thought money made you untouchable," Jordan said. "But integrity doesn't need a balance sheet." A ripple passed through the crowd. A few nodded quietly, as if they were seeing something they had long forgotten. Jordan turned toward Sophia, the young waitress still holding her phone. His eyes softened his voice, calm but firm. "Send that video to this address," he said, handing her another card. "Legal will handle the rest. You'll be compensated for your courage." Sophia shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Sir, I didn't do it for money." Jordan smiled faintly. "That's why you deserve it." The words caught in her throat, and in that moment, in a ballroom full of privilege and pride, Sophia Alvarez, the 22-year-old waitress, became the living proof of something money could never buy: dignity. In the far corner, Marcus Bennett, the middle-aged black waiter, set his tray down and clasped his hands together. "I saw it all too," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying weight without force. Jordan nodded slowly. "Good. Keep it safe." Truth travels faster when it's carried by more than one person. From the press table, Lauren lowered her camera, her eyes shining as if she had just witnessed a rare moral lesson in a noisy world. "Mr. Ellis," she asked, "can I quote that too?" Jordan's thin smile glinted like a blade. "Quote it. Maybe it'll remind someone that silence isn't weakness." And in that instant, everyone in the room understood that this was no longer a clash between two men or two corporations. It was a mirror, reflecting a truth society had long tried to avoid. Respect is not a privilege. It is an obligation. Will screamed, his voice breaking under desperation. "You think this is over? You'll regret this." Ellis Jordan looked at him, his eyes calm as still water after a storm. No, Will. You will. Because regret is the tax of arrogance. A few people began to clap. First one, then two, then three. It wasn't applause of celebration, it was acknowledgement. Brooke stood up quietly, removed her engagement ring, and placed it on the table beside Will. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I can't stay beside someone who doesn't understand respect. Will reached for her hand, but she was already walking away. The click of her heels on the marble floor echoed through the hall like a sentence being read aloud. Jordan watched her go without a word. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, a small gesture that closed the chapter. From the ceiling, Speaker's Jenna Park's voice came through once more. Containment complete, sir. Legal team on site. Press release prepared. Jordan responded with one short word. Proceed. Instantly, 3 large screens around the room came to life. The Ellis Capital Group logo appeared, followed by white text on a black background. Merger terminated. Legal review active. Harrington Industries under audit. The crowd erupted into chaos. One guest gasped. He's broadcasting it. Live, my God, it's public. Will collapsed back into his chair, his hands gripping his head. On his phone screen, notifications began flashing one after another. Transaction declined. Account restricted. Hold initiated pending investigation. The room was bright, but Will saw only darkness, the darkness of truth revealed. Jordan stood still, calm, watching him, as one might study a finished lesson. His voice was quiet, meant only for those close enough to hear. You called me staff. I called you consequence. Then he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed softly but firmly, leaving behind not just a ruined gala, but the beginning of a new era of truth. And when the doors of the Astoria Grand opened, the cold New York wind swept in, carrying away the scent of wine, of arrogance, of defeat, leaving behind only one scent, the scent of justice newly born. Outside the Astoria Grand, New York City still glittered as if nothing had happened. But inside the world of William Harrington III had just collapsed, not with an explosion, but with deliberate silence. Whispers began to ripple through the room, like a slow-rising tide. From journalists to guests, everyone murmured the same question. How could a man mistaken for staff bring an empire to its knees with just a few words? Jordan Ellis remained there, composed, calm, as though he hadn't just dismantled a $50 billion deal. No one could understand how he maintained that stillness, but those who looked into his eyes could see something no money could ever buy: the certainty of a man who knew his own worth. From across the room, Lauren Kim, the Forbes Live reporter, was still filming. Her voice trembled with emotion. What began as humiliation has turned into corporate history. Jordan turned, caught her gaze, and gave a faint nod, a wordless permission. Behind him, Will still sat motionless, his head in his hands, sweat sliding down his pale face. Everything inside him had fallen apart. His pride, his reputation, his illusion of eternal power. Brooke, the woman who once walked beside him with confidence, had left, leaving only her engagement ring gleaming coldly on the table, reflecting a pale white light. She was gone along with the last shred of respect the room had for him. Jordan stepped closer to the central table where Will sat frozen. He studied him for a moment, his voice low and steady, like the final lesson in a classroom. You called security on me and my own deal. Now you'll see what real security looks like. His hand moved across his phone. Instantly, the voice of Jenna Park echoed through the room, sharp and professional. Final authorization in process. Effective immediately, all Harrington executives removed from system access. The 3 large screens lit up at once, each displaying a bold red message. Access denied W. Harrington. Account suspended corporate breach. A wave of sound swept across the room, heavy breathing chairs, shifting the pounding of hearts. Will stared at the screen, disbelief etched on his face. You can't do that," he shouted, his voice cracking. Jordan replied with a single sentence that silenced the room. "I just did." Daniel Cho stepped forward holding a tablet. "Sir, confirmation received. Legal documents filed under immediate termination clause." Priya Patel added her tone, calm but unyielding. "All subsidiaries under Harrington Industries are now subject to audit. Estimated financial impact, 4.8 billion. The sound of typing and data streaming through the internal network blended together like a cold symphony of justice. There were no sirens, no shouting, no police, only process evidence and authority. Will grabbed his phone with shaking hands, but as he unlocked it, notifications began to flash, one after another. Transactions blocked, account frozen, portfolio locked pending review. Desperation overtook him. He lifted his head, eyes wet, with a fear he had once believed belonged only to others. "You ruined me," he whispered hoarsely. Jordan answered softly, "No, Will. You educated yourself." A ripple of whispers ran through the crowd, then faded into silence. Lauren wrote the line quickly into her notebook, marking it as the quote of the night you educated yourself. Behind them, Sofia Alvarez stood with her hands clasped, her eyes shining. She was no longer just a witness, she was seeing the rebirth of justice. Jordan turned toward her and spoke quietly. "Send the video to Jenna. Legal will handle the rest." She nodded, her lips trembling. "Sir, do you want me to stop recording now?" Jordan shook his head. "No. Truth deserves a final frame." He turned back to face the crowd. The light from the screens glowed across his face, outlining his jaw in silver, as if carved from steel. His voice carried softly, but it reached every corner of the room. "If anyone here's still confused about what happened tonight," he paused, his gaze sweeping over each bowed head, "just remember this power doesn't need to shout to be heard." One line and a current ran through the room. Lauren turned to her cameraman and whispered, "That line's going viral before midnight." In the corner, an older Wall Street investor began to clap. The sound was faint at first, but it spread slowly, one clap at a time, until the whole room filled with hesitant applause, tinged with awe. No one was celebrating the fall, they were honoring the truth. Will still sat, clutching his phone, his face pale. On the screen, the final message appeared, "Access permanently revoked." He looked up, his voice ragged and weak. "You think you won?" Ellis Jordan looked back, his eyes no longer cold but filled with pity. "No, Will. I just stopped playing." He turned and began walking toward the door. Behind him, the orchestra's automated system came alive, playing a strange new tune, slow, solemn, a requiem for a fallen dynasty. The chandeliers reflected off the marble floor where the red wine still stained the stone, glimmering like blood, and roses intertwined. No one cleaned it. No one moved because they all understood it was the scar of a lesson. As Jordan placed his hand on the grand wooden door, Sophia called out, her voice trembling. "Sir, what should I call this?" Jordan stopped without turning around. "Call it whatever you want," he said. "Just make sure they remember who cleaned the floor." Then he pushed the door open and walked out. No one followed. No one spoke. They just watched the man, once humiliated, leaving the room with the poise of a king, silent, proud, and absolute. Outside, the New York night wind swept through the marble corridor. Jordan took a deep breath and adjusted his cufflinks, an old familiar gesture now transformed into a symbol of calm amid the storm. He didn't look back, because he knew that behind him, the entire world was staring into a mirror for the first time, finally seeing the true face of power. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't wealth. It was dignity held firm even when misunderstood. And that night in the city, that never sleeps a lesson, was written not in ink, but in the silence of a man who had once been humiliated and chose to walk away as though the whole world was watching. The New York night wind blew hard, carrying the chill of winter and the lingering echo of what had just unfolded. Behind the closed doors of the Astoria Grand, the world of power was still reeling, but Jordan Ellis had already stepped into another reality. He was no longer the man mistaken for a staff member. He was now the embodiment of something money could never buy: self-respect. The glow from the streetlights reflected across his face, glinting through the window of the waiting car. Inside, Jenna Park appeared on his phone screen, her voice calm as always. Containment complete. The markets reacting exactly as predicted. The board has issued a statement they're proud of you. Jordan looked out the window at the city streets, where people moved along, unaware that tonight in the heart of Manhattan, a lesson in dignity had been written. He replied slowly, "Good. Make sure the message isn't about me. Make it about respect." Jenna smiled faintly through the screen. Already done. Jordan leaned back in his seat. In the stillness, an image surfaced in his mind, the memory of his father, the old janitor with the worn broom in hand. His father's voice echoed softly. "You can be misunderstood. You can be judged. But if you hold on to your dignity, you've never truly lost." Now those words were no longer just a memory, they had become a way of life. And tonight, they had rewritten the rules of an entire system. Back in the grand hall, the guests had yet to leave. They looked at one another in silence, each realizing the same truth. It wasn't power that had been defeated, it was arrogance. It wasn't a CEO being glorified, it was integrity being restored. Lauren Kim sent out her first report under the headline, "The Night Dignity. Spoke when silence spoke louder than money." The video Sophia recorded spread across the internet like a storm, millions of views within hours. In the comments, one line stood out. He didn't raise his voice, but the world heard him anyway. Jordan smiled softly as he read it. He knew there was nothing more he needed to say. The car turned onto the avenue, the golden lights sweeping across the glass. Jordan adjusted his cufflinks, his reflection merging with the city ahead, a city still learning how to listen to the silence that speaks. He whispered quietly, almost to himself. Justice doesn't shout. It signs the deal and walks away. And as his car disappeared into the sea of glowing towers, the story of that night continued to echo like a symphony, where every note was a lesson and every silence was a reminder. Dignity never needs to be proven. It only needs to be preserved, even in the places where people have forgotten it most. The next morning, the sky over New York was unusually clear. Sunlight streamed down the glass towers of Wall Street, where headlines rippled across screens like waves. Harrington Industries loses control after gala night at the Astoria Grand. Jordan Ellis, the black CEO who made Wall Street go silent. All of America was talking about him, not because of the fall of an empire, but because of how he did it with absolute composure and the dignity of a man who didn't need to shout to be heard. In the office of Ellis Capital Group, Jordan stood before the vast window, looking down at the avenue below. Hundreds of people moved through the streets, each carrying a story, a dream and a fear. He understood that not everyone had the chance to speak up, and that was exactly why he existed. Jenna Park walked in a fresh report in hand. Stocks up 12% since the announcement, she said. But people aren't talking about the numbers. They're talking about the message. Jordan smiled faintly. Then we did it right. He walked to his desk, where an old photograph of his father still rested, the man who once held a mop in the same hotel where his son had just restored justice. Jordan placed his hand gently on the frame and whispered, "You taught me how to stand tall, even when I was invisible." A moment of silence passed before he turned back, his voice calm and firm. "Send a donation to Astoria Grand's maintenance staff. Quietly. No press." Jenna nodded and smiled. She understood for Jordan, victory was never about glory, but about restoration. Meanwhile, in a small apartment in Queens, Sofia Alvarez sat on her couch, watching the news on her phone. The video she had filmed now had over 40 million views, and the top pinned comment came from Ellis Capital itself. "This video belongs to the people who never stopped believing in dignity." She began to cry, not for the reward, but because she realized her small act of courage had reached the world. At the same time, on the trading floor, Harrington Industries' stock continued to plummet. Will no longer had a seat on the board. Everything he once believed was eternal now existed only as numbers on a fading screen. As for Jordan, he didn't need to speak of that night again. The world was already speaking for him. When the afternoon light streamed through the glass window, glinting across his composed face, Jordan spoke softly. "Power fades. Respect endures." And then he turned away, leaving behind not a legacy of titles or triumph, but one simple truth. Sometimes silence alone is enough to change the course of the world. From the perspective of an expert in leadership ethics and corporate culture, the story of Jordan Ellis is not just a confrontation between wealth and dignity, but a reminder that dignity is not something granted by others. It is what we hold on to even when we are looked down upon. In a world where power is often measured by noise, Jordan proved that silence, when paired with integrity, can make an entire system listen. This is not the victory of one man, but the triumph of a belief that respect is always stronger than status. If you believe that true strength comes from calmness and fairness, like to spread that message, subscribe to never miss the stories where ethics shine through power, and comment with the phrase that reflects your belief. Hold your dignity.